Hello everybody and welcome back to another faction guide for Divide at Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Arevaci, who are a uniquely spear-dependent faction. They specialize in shock spears and melee spear fighters who don't fight in a formation, giving them a very loose, but also very grindy playstyle. After all, spears don't kill nearly as quickly as swords, albeit they're incredibly effective against cavalry, making the Arevaci one of those more cumbersome factions, one of those factions that requires greater strategy and tactics to properly deploy. Amongst the different Iberian factions, I consider them the most difficult, by far the most creative when it comes to the type of strategies that you need to employ to win your battles. So if you want a challenge as well as a very unique faction, the Arevaci are definitely for you. So let's go look at the campaign map and figure out how best we can start out a campaign as the Arevaci. Alright everybody, so the Arevaci start position is not a super precarious one, however, it is one that requires a lot of nuance to appreciate, because you do start out smack dab in the middle of Hispania, as you can see here, and subsequently you can have many allies, but you can also have many enemies, so you don't ever want to overextend yourself. You don't ever want to be fighting a multiple front war, because ultimately your enemies can come and destroy you with ease if you're surrounded by them. Now, you do start out with one ally and one enemy, making this not a super combative start position, and you do have an ally, which is rather unique, like a defensive ally. So at the end of the day, this is honestly not a terrible start position at all when it comes to who you can potentially fight. And your enemy, mind you, are the Lusitani, who are all the way over here in Lusitania. And this mountain range that you see here is basically impassable. So the only way that they would get to you is if they went through Ebora, which is owned by a different faction, and then went up these mountains, or if they went all the way up here and then took like a right turn to Numantia. Essentially, you can't get to the Lusitani and they can't get to you. It's just as you expand towards each other, inevitably, you'll end up coming to grips. But the other thing is that they don't exactly despise you a ton. Like, they're hostile, but not even by that much. Like, if you wanted to end this war, and believe me, you can do it after a couple of turns. But if you want to end it turn one, I mean, you can see, like, it doesn't cost that much to get to moderate. And, I mean, actually, it's weird that we can't get it all the way to high, but, like, turn one, we could end the war between us and the Lusitani pretty quickly and get us to neutral terms. So at the end of the day, we don't really need to be at war with them. This doesn't have to be a part of your game plan every time for the Arevaci start position. You can choose to expand to anywhere that you want. And my advice would be to expand into Telekinesis. One, if you expand here, you won't have to fight against the Carthaginians, who are inarguably the strongest power in Hispania come turn one. Sure, the Carthaginians rarely invest a lot of money early game into invading or defending their Hispanian possessions, but if you attack them really quickly, they probably will focus on you, especially if Rome hasn't declared war on them yet, so you do have to consider that little tidbit. The other thing is that Telekinesis is connected in a way where you can quite easily conquer all of it from where you are. I mean, you can see, like, all of the settlements aren't too far from Numantia, and they're kind of in a straight line, and they all share a direct border with Numantia, making it honestly pretty easy. I think by far the most convenient province for you to conquer. Conquering Ispassum or Mastia would involve declaring war on Carthage, and Arce is owned by your ally. That's why I would really recommend that you focus on Hispania. Just use it as your home base and make Telekinesis your first connected province. Or, of course, you can go south into Baetica. However, while all these things are quite close, you'd have to conquer Gadir, which is right across the Straits of Gibraltar with North Africa. So, do you really want to have a border with Carthage right in North Africa? Probably not. Like, Carthage could always recruit a reinforcing army over here in Mauritania and send it across to attack Spain. So by taking Gadir, you will basically expose yourself to the entire military capacity of North Africa. And that's just being unstrategic. That's just being dumb. Telekinesis is so much easier to maintain, so much easier to hold, and will be so much easier to conquer. Of course, you could go into Lusitania as well. It's the last province of Hispania that I haven't mentioned. But as I mentioned, like these guys are kind of on the edge of the map. Getting here through your start position is really difficult, so I would just wait. Now, when it comes to Numantia, you have a decent starting population, a lot of warriors, a lot of second class, where the majority of your troops will be recruited from, so it's a solid population when it comes to recruitment. Your province isn't all too good when it comes to population. It's 40% Punic, so you will have a negative culture debuff, which means that Numantia will inevitably succumb to public disorder and public unrest over time. But if you conquer Telekinesis, which is a much more Hispanic province, you won't really have that problem, and you can kind of make this your home base. Numantia will become a little bit of an afterthought over time. It's not really an important city for you in your campaign. You also do start out with a lot of military technology research, so you can just start building your tier 2 barrack right away. I'd recommend the infantry one. Literally no reason to get the cavalry one right away. You can of course upgrade this settlement. Maybe not worth it, to be fair, but I've kind of toyed around with this, and it's not super rewarding to get this one, especially because you're going to need a lot of money for your army. Now, when it comes to your turn 1 recruitment, you do have some decent options. You have 2 pretty decent early game spears, a Skitari, which is significantly more defensive, and a medium spearman, which is more offensive. Now, the only thing I like about the Skitari is that it has better morale, but when it comes to actual statistics and like application in battle, I really consider the medium spearmen better. Like, they have a massive 23 charge bonus, which gives these guys a shock element, but the Skitari won't have. They, of course, have more melee attack too, but the Skitari do have more morale, and of course way more melee defense, so these guys will last longer. But I kind of just like the medium spearmen because they're just going to go into battle and kill a little bit quicker, which is a luxury when it comes to spears. So I would get a bunch of these, maybe a couple of Skitari to have in the flanks since we're just more stable. Getting one of these painted warriors would be decent, a good idea in like an early game army. These guys cause a fear effect, which can help you rout a flank, but they're not particularly strong in combat. So be wary about keeping them locked in battle for too long. They're merely to destroy your opponent's morale. This skirmisher cavalry is okay for like turn 1 cav, so you can just get like one more just to kind of beef up your cavalry and make sure that you have one. And when it comes to your mercenaries, you have really good options in this province. Like, these mercenary infantrymen are insane. They're absolutely amazing. 16 melee attack and 13 melee defense is absolutely elite. Now, the rest of the stats on this Iberian infantryman are pretty basic, pretty run-of-the-mill, nothing exceptional, I would say, but still definitely a worthy pickup just for the melee attack and defense alone. So definitely hire these guys for exceptional units. Balearic slingers are great, but you know, with your turn 1 income being a little bit precarious, you know, you just have one minor settlement after all, with a population that you're going to have to exploit thoroughly for military, you're not going to have a ton of income coming in. So I'd just recommend not going for Balearic Slingers right away. They're absolutely a phenomenal unit for later once you have money, but I'd say hold off. Instead, get these Arevaci Slingers for your, like, for your skirmish line, as well as a bunch of these medium spears. Now, the reason why I'd recommend that you upgrade this turn 1 is because you unlock your Arevaci champions, who aren't an amazing noble sword unit. Notice they only have 25 armor, which is, you know, it's not bad for an early game unit that you're going to get 6 turns into the campaign. It's actually really good, but going in later into the campaign, this unit's really not going to be useful because of his 25 armor. It's just a severe limitation to have under 30 armor as an elite sword. But regardless, it's going to help you out in early game quite a bit. So if you kind of wait and recruit your army a little bit slower than you need to, you can get a couple of those noble swords. I'd probably recommend bringing like 3 of them, along with a solid core of spearmen, whichever ones you prefer. You know, maybe an additional cavalry unit, some Skitari sword mercenaries when you can get them, and that would be a solid Arevaci early game army. Very stable, very high armor. You know, some really good killing units like with Arevaci champions, you know, a shock unit for morale, some okayish early game cavalry. Because overall, it's not an insane early game roster or early game army, but it will be a very beefy one, and one with, honestly, more quality than you'd expect of a barbarian army so early in the game. So that's really all I can say. Like, you have a lot of opportunities to expand and gain access to some pretty strong resources in Hispania in early game. to one empire that you could be pitted against, you don't share a direct border with, so you can keep your distance with Carthage pretty easy. None of the other Iberian factions are going to wish you ill too. It's really your diplomatic standing. I mean, you can see just across the board, like most of them actually like you turn one. So just in general, you can use this to get some really nice agreements. You can bind on aggressions if you want. You can get trades with, relative ease. These guys will do non-aggression in a couple of turns. I'll let you guys know. So just in general, you can divide and conquer quite easily. Just don't declare war heedlessly. Don't declare war across, against alliances or betray your allies unfairly. Like, be honorable, and you can quite easily consolidate an Hispanian empire and sweep across the map. That's really all I have to say when it comes to your start position. Now let's look at the buffs and debuffs that the Arevaci have. Now when it comes to the buffs and debuffs of the Arevaci, you get the standard Iberian ones, which are horsemanship, which gives you +1 experience rank for cavalry recruits. Now the Arevaci do have some pretty solid cavalry. They are very usable cavalry. They're a little bit odd, I'll be honest, and I'll explain more later when we look at the army of the Arevaci, but this +1 experience is just a solid thing to have. Ultimately, it's experience chevrons, which really make your units much stronger in campaign. They're just really important for getting an edge against your foes. So to be able to recruit experienced horsemen right from the onset, just in your barrack, it's a huge, huge plus, and it's really good to have. Devodio increases the attributes for all generals, which just basically means that a general unit will get like +1 or +2 of all the combat stats right away. It just makes the general kind of overpowered when it comes to Iberian factions. Not like insane, but just really, really good, really, really strong. And that's kind of good. It's not going to be game breaking or anything, because none of the Iberian generals are just absurdly powerful, although the Arevaci have the strongest ones, so definitely a plus for the Arevaci. But at the end of the day, it's only a couple of points, so the general's still ultimately killable, but it's just a nice thing to have. It's not one of those broken buffs, though. Definitely not that. Now, when it comes to the Arevaci exclusive ones, you get increased morale when defending. I don't find myself defending a ton in campaign. Of course, it's nice because this doesn't mean that you have to be on your own territory. Like a lot of defensive buffs are like on your own territory. You get plus statistics or something, but this is just in general. So if you've kind of overextended yourself, become a little bit more ambitious in your offensive campaigns, and you find yourself defending against 2 armies simultaneously, this is going to activate, which actually makes this kind of useful. Now, 1 people is really good, because it gives you a diplomatic bonus with Iberians, and you can see the outcome of that. Positive relations with almost every faction. The ability to pretty easily end your turn 1 war with the Lusitani. And most turn 1 wars in Divide et Impera are impossible to end. It's just like a real hatred, which is unshakable. So that's actually really, really, really strong. That's really, really strong. And it allows you to quite easily dominate a region which isn't super competitive, that being Iberia. So honestly, strong buff. Really strong buff here. Now, increased mercenary costs is a little bit unfortunate because I feel like Iberia has some of the coolest and best mercenaries in the game. But this really isn't a super duper challenging thing to overcome, because mercenaries are definitely not an essential thing to use in any Divide et Impera campaign. Like, I can quite easily win a campaign without ever recruiting a single mercenary. Mercenaries are a nice thing to have, and it's unfortunate that this debuff makes them an unattractive option. But at the end of the day, it's really not that bad to deal with. So at the end of the day, like the buffs that the Arevaci have, just give them a nice little leg up. Better general, better horsemen, increased morale in defensive battles, and a super strong diplomatic bonus. This increased mercenary costs isn't really that bad. So overall, the Arevaci, they benefit a lot from their buffs, and their debuffs is kind of unimportant. So they do really well here. Now, in contrast to their buffs and debuffs, the actual quality of the Arevaci army is a little bit difficult to grasp at first. Like, when I was looking at this faction, I had actually crafted the argument that they're actually not a very strong barbarian faction. In fact, I believe them to be not super powerful and by far the weakest of the Iberians. However, as I've examined the stats of these units in depth, I realized that the Arevaci are actually a really strong faction. They have some absolute gems of spear units. Now, I believe that because their spears are truly the main asset of their army, You know, for spears are by far the most powerful quality of our army, but they wouldn't be very good, because spears in Rome 2 do tend to be a little bit weak. Like, they pretty much always lose to swordsmen, at least that's a traditional logic. However, the spears of the Arevaci are actually insanely cost-effective and absolutely capable of killing sword units pretty soundly. Like, not all the time, they won't clobber the most elite swords of, say, Galatia or Rome, or something like that. However, units will do exceptionally well in those types of situations, and they have some decent swordsmen to offer too, and some cavalry options, which aren't bad. Their missile infantry has some killing potential for sure too, just making them an overall extremely strong faction, which with a little bit of a unique gate because of how powerful their spears are. But let's first look at the generals and see what we have on offer here. There's a couple of generals for the Arevaci that are entirely unique to their general units. Like, 2 of these units you can't get regularly. I know that this spear unit is also featured here, but you can't recruit this unit in campaign from your barrack. Like, you can recruit them in custom battle, but I tried to look everywhere to try to figure out how to get the Vasky shock spears. They weren't in your barracks, they weren't in your, like, town hall buildings, they weren't in a temple, they weren't in an agricultural building, a commercial building, a port. I just don't think that you can get them normally in campaign. I looked at the public order buildings too, just truly they are elusive for some reason. Now, if someone finds where they are, I would be extraordinarily thankful. I like that a lot. But I couldn't find them, and I looked pretty deeply, pretty thoroughly. Again, there's a possibility that I missed them, but I don't think that you can recruit them from any building. I believe that they're exclusive to your general. That's because they're honestly pretty dang good. They're honestly really, really good. Like, this unit would be kind of overpowered if you can get them easily, particularly in early game if they are available turn 1. If this is like a late game unit, I could see it, because these guys have a little bit weaker stats than a Getic Noble Spear does in late game, albeit that's like a turn 100 unit, this one. You know what, they have the same cost, which makes me believe that the Getic Noble Spear must be missing some other quality that these guys have. I think that they have lower morale, the Getic Noble Spears, but they have better melee defense by 2. And they have the same charge bonus, weapon damage, armor penetration, bonus there's cavalry. Oh, okay, these guys have a javelin volley. That explains it. The javelin volley is ranked. But anyway, this is a really powerful unit, and I couldn't find them anywhere, so I believe that these guys are just entirely for the bodyguard. It even says that these guys are a bodyguard in the description. So I think it's just a glitch that they're in custom battle. But anyway, we'll stop yapping about that. The first general unit that you have are the Arevaci Noble Spearmen. If these guys are a very, very solid Noble Spear, they are available to recruit normally. You don't get them from your barrack, though. You get them from your town hall buildings. From, like, a settlement building. If you get them from, like, you know, your capital, your walled settlement, it's going to be your 3rd tier settlement building that gets these guys. If it's like a minor settlement, it's going to be tier 4. So this take a little bit of a while to recruit them, but because they come from your settlement buildings, you can basically get them from any province, which is nice. It is nice, particularly because they feature 35 armor, which is solid, but elite combat stats. 21 melee defense is obscene, as well as a massive bonus versus cavalry of 25. These guys are a super duper solid unit to have on your main line, extremely good on the flanks. The only problem is that they're not going to kill a ton. You know, 26 weapon damage is not great for a noble unit. A typical noble sword would have more than that, either 30 or 28. 9 melee attack is really bad, meaning that while these guys don't do a particularly high amount of damage, we also don't hit particularly often. So ultimately, this isn't really an amazing game-breaking unit by any means, but just extremely solid, great archetype of what a noble spear should be. And you can get them pretty easily. I think the main asset of this is that once you get into like late game, you're gonna have these in basically every province. So you're not gonna be constrained on having to have like high tier barracks to get a noble unit. You're gonna be able to get them pretty easily, which is nice. Now, I honestly don't think you should ever take this unit as your general. I think it should be one of these two, because as their unique units, they're just also extraordinarily powerful. Like, literally the team of Divide et Impera was like, we're going to give these guys have some extremely powerful general options, but they're going to be so strong that you can only get one of them. So, you know, that's really an indicator that you should bring one of these over to a unit that you can get really easily. Now, this unit, the Arevaci Shock Spears, extraordinarily powerful spear. Extraordinarily powerful spear unit. 38 armor means that they're quite capable of surviving. This isn't the unit that'll fade or die easily. They have a heavy mass to reinforce that further. You know, 19 bonus versus cavalry, means that they're not going to be easily displaced by cavalry in battle. It also means that if you have these guys on the flanks, they can do absolutely phenomenal damage to enemy cavalry that they'll encounter. And you absolutely should have this guy on the flank because they have a 29 charge bonus. Obscene shock unit. Absolutely crazy at getting a rear charge and just doing immense damage that way. Now, its 25 weapon damage is a little bit restrictive. You know, they're not going to do a ton of damage on a hit, but the 14 melee attack means that they'll hit often, and 15 melee defense means that they can also survive in combat for a while. Since this unit is solid at grinding and has a really crazy shock. You know, it's just such a high utility unit. I'd actually compare them to Thracian nobles. And that comparison should demonstrate how powerful they are. Now, they're not as overpowered as Thracian nobles, but they can absolutely kill like a late game Galatian sword. You know, they won't kill it easily, but they'll eke out a victory, a slight victory. And that's insane for a unit that can simultaneously do crazy damage against cavalry and has great shock value. So, while this unit isn't absolutely overpowered like a Thracian noble is, they're overpowered in the sense that they're like a utility knife, just good at everything. Such a great unit. Now, the Arevaci Noble Lancers is just a super solid cavalry unit. This is displayed in their 12 melee attack and 14 melee defense. This unit's going to be so good against enemy cavalry in combat while simultaneously offering a pretty impressive 52 charge bonus. This is one of those units that can effectively charge almost as well as a shock cavalry, while being much more competent in melee than a shock cavalry ever would be. It's just overall a really good cavalry unit, and definitely worth bringing if you want superior mobility to your general. But I really feel like the Arevaci Shock Spear is the better option out of all of these. It's just so useful, and it's going to be cheaper than your cavalry too. But if you do feel like you're kind of bad with infantry generals, so they tend to die a little bit too easily, then bring your cavalry option. That's always an option. Now, I do have to say that all of your units have guerrilla deployment here. I forgot to mention, but with the Lusitani, with the Editani, every single Iberian faction has guerrilla deployment on all of their units. So that's going to be really important to seeing how you, like, utilize these units, you know, imagining how best to use them. And because you can guerrilla deploy, you can get really close to your opponent right away and just kind of charge through of only maybe one volley of skirmish fire being exchanged. And because of that, you know, bringing a spear general, bringing an infantry general in general, might be more advantageous with the Iberian factions because you don't have to maneuver nearly as much, and your infantry is going to be able to get in nice and personal without suffering from intense skirmish fire. So, you know, that's just another incentive to bring the Arevaci Shock Spears. Now, for your melee infantry, I'll be honest, your melee infantry is generally mediocre except for your higher tiers. Your lower tiers are kind of useless. In fact, uselessness starts with this Arevaci short swordmen, which is just terrible. I mean, sure, you can recruit them pretty early on in your campaign, but the only good thing about this unit is that it has 4 speed. This is a uniquely quick infantry unit. They're just insanely fast. They run at the speed of skirmishers, making these guys pretty good at killing enemy skirmishers. You know, you charge these guys into combat. They'll kill a generic skirmisher. However, their combat stats are absolutely abysmal. Like, besides killing, like, a slinger or an archer, like a tier 1 slinger or archer, or a militia, these guys won't do anything. They're just disturbingly bad. 10 melee attack and 5 melee defense is not good. It's not horrible for a turn 1 unit, but everything else is just so bad. Like, 13 charge bonus is egregious. 21 weapon damage is so low for a sword. And 1 armor is obviously pathetic. Just a terrible unit. Sure, they're really, really, really cheap, But there's reason for this. They effectively have no value in an army. Like, I just don't know what you do with these. They're a liability. Don't bring them. Your Arevaci spear skirmishers are kind of a weird unit. They're kind of comparable to Greek infantry. You know, the ones that you get like turn 1? These guys have no armor, but they do have 3 volleys of javelins. You know, they have bonus, there's cavalry too. But it's just like their melee stats are so bad, and their armor is so low, but if they get into combat with anything except a low tier cavalry because of that bonus, they're not really going to do a lot. And considering how you can guerrilla deploy really close to your enemy, I don't really see the value in bringing a more skirmishy, very light infantry. You know, you're not going to get those javelin volleys off with ease, and you don't really need to skirmish against your opponent extensively. So I just don't really see the value in bringing this, but if you're really low on money, and these guys come from your third population, so you can get them without considering your population, maybe it's worth bringing them. You know, at least they can kind of stand in your second line and throw his javelins and be somewhat effective. They can run down a skirmisher, they can help combat cavalry on the flanks, maybe get a little bit of a rear charge, because 16 charge bonus isn't terrible. So these guys can offer some utility in a build, but at the end of the day, they're just not particularly great. Now, your Arevaci painted warriors are a severe disappointment, because the Lusitani bear warriors are so good. You know, considering that those are your main Iberian adversaries, and they just have an insane shock unit, like an almost game-breaking shock unit, just an absurdly powerful one. To have such a weak one is really not helpful. Not helpful if you want to compare the Arevaci to the Lusitani and conclude that they're just as good. Like, this unit is a blow against their credibility, because it only has 1 armor, you know, an 18 charge bonus, which, you know, it's good. It's comparable to Roman legionaries, but considering that these guys will get obliterated in a grind out fight, it's not really good. Like, the only real good stat of these guys combat wise is that 16 melee attack is pretty crazy. You know, they'll get some kills, but they die really easily. Like, whenever you leave these guys in prolonged combat or you charge them frontally into an enemy, they just get flattened. They just get killed. These guys are basically exclusively for charging the enemy along the flanks. But of course, that proves a challenge when cavalry can flatten this unit. And if like an enemy flank unit charges these guys directly, you know, these guys just won't be able to hold on. If you leave these guys in combat for too long, they'll just die too. These guys are almost entirely here to deliver this fear effect that they cause, you see? They scare everyone. So they lower enemy morale. So that's kind of useful. But there's such a liability in combat. So that's a bit of a problem, but they are useful to bring. The scare effect in Divide et Impera is very powerful. So you can use these guys, but beware. You don't want to bring more than 1 or 2 max in an army. Otherwise, you're hindering your own fighting ability far too much. Your light infantry is not a good early game swordsman. I'll be completely honest. For light of mass, 15 charge bonus is really bad, and 23 weapon damage, while acceptable for an early game sword, is kind of at the lowest end that you could possibly accept. Really, the only good thing about this unit is that at least they have 3 movement speed, a javelin volley, and come with 15 armor, making them not entirely terrible at holding. But your spears are so much better than this guy that it's just a massive disservice to yourself to bring this unit. Just overall not very good. I just don't think it's a particularly reliable early game infantry, and you have far better options. Now, your Arevaci champion is by far the worst Iberian noble sword. Like, the Editani have a really good one. The Lusitani are straight in the middle. You're at the end. The only good thing about this unit is that you can recruit it come turn 6, as I demonstrated. Once you build a level 2 barrack, and you can start building at turn 1, you can get these guys. So while they're not great, you do have access to them quicker than anyone else. So use that advantageously and bring a couple of these in your early army. Nobody's going to have a noble sword, even if this is a pathetic excuse for a noble sword. And by the way, this, you know, dislike of this unit comes entirely from having 25 armor. 25 armor is pathetic for a noble unit. You know, a good noble unit should have at least 30, preferably 35 or 38, even 41 at the highest end. So You have very low armor, making this unit a little bit bad at surviving. But these guys can cut enemy down. They're a very grindy unit with 28 weapon damage. With 21 charge means that they can also hit pretty hard initially. 14 melee attack and 13 melee defense is pretty dang good. It's really good. It's not the best. It's definitely not the best. You know, but it is good. It is noble tier. Now moving on, once you hit your reforms, which come turn 90, you get this Iberian Reformed Heavy Swordsman. Every Iberian faction has these. These guys are similar to Gallic swords, except they have one less melee defense. Everything else is identical statistically, except, and here's the second difference, the Iberian Reformed Heavy Swordsmen have more armor on average. Like the Arverni and the Galatian Celtic swords do have 38 armor alongside these guys, but the rest don't, I believe, actually. I forgot about the Nervii. Let me check. The Nervii, their chosen sword has 35, although their noble has 38, but that doesn't really count. You can only get one Nervii noble. But yeah, so these guys have more armor than almost all of the standard swords of other Celtic-inspired factions. And mind you, that the Gallic swords I mentioned, the Galatians and the Arverni ones, come from your first population class. These Iberian ones that were egalitarian, they come from your second population class, making them significantly easier to recruit. So this is honestly a solid unit. It's not amazing, you know, it won't stand up to the finest Roman Imperial legionaries or anything like that, or as I mentioned, your Galatians or your Arverni Oathsworn. However, they are very, very solid and very, very useful. You know, they'll make a great accompaniment to your spears in the context of this roster, and totally worth bringing. Also, the guerrilla deploy too, which is a nice perk, of course, that those pesky Gauls don't have, or those Romans. So, you know, if you fear the skirmish component of an enemy army, these swordsmen can get big and aggressive and just charge right in. And you can bring plenty of these in your army. They are pretty cost effective. So, great unit, totally worth bringing. Phenomenal fighters. Now moving on to your spears, this is definitely the most unique and focused upon part of your roster here is our Arevaci. Your light spearmen are just okay. You know, they're solid. For the cost, they're pretty good. These guys are exceptionally cheap. They cost like 50 or 60 coins or denarii or whatever, sesterci. I don't know what in-game currency is called. Drachma, whatever it might be. But it costs very little, like 60 to maintain them. And they have pretty good stats. You know, we have like standard malicious spear stats at 7 and 14, but they also have 3 movement speed and 1 volley of javelins. So I'd say these guys are like above average when it comes to cheap malicious spears. Now the rest of your spears come from your first or second population class. So these are your only third pop spears, but they're just very cheap. You know, in an early game army, you can definitely have a couple of these on the flanks to ward off cavalry. But other than that, obviously, they're not going to be amazingly cost-effective or combat-effective. I mean, they are levy spears at the end of the day, but they'll do a job against cavalry, just holding your flanks, that type of thing. Your Arevaci medium spearmen are really good. You can get them turn 1. Really strong unit. You know, melee attack, melee defense is really good. Charge bonus of 23 is solid. Weapon damage of 21 is a little bit low. But this is a spear unit. You don't expect them to be the best at grinding in combat for too long. And they have 225 men in a medium mass. So at the end of the day, they have to be weak somewhere. That weakness will be found in weapon damage as well as their base morale, which is only 39. But they even have 3 speed and 1, you know, volley of javelins. Just such a solid unit. Such a great unit. Very cheap as well. Just the only problems that they do come from your second population class, so you have to be a little bit wary about having the population to recruit these guys. But because so many settlements in Iberia are Iberian cultured, it's pretty easy to find warriors to recruit, just in general. This is not a campaign where you're going to struggle with population immensely, so, you know, honestly, really, really good unit, really, really cool unit, an absolute gem of his roster, and what really makes the Arevaci really strong in early game, in my opinion. You know, to have these champions pretty early on, to have these like really elite general units turn 1, and to have like a really solid line of spears that could do, you know, effective charge damage as well as do okay in a melee slog and have 50 in armor. It just makes this roster so safe and just so powerful from early game, just overwhelming in early game. Your other spear option are the Skitarii, and these guys are a lot more defensive. Like, they have identical stats to a Freo spear, except they have a little bit more morale, but 5 less armor. You know, Freo spears are a little bit better too, because these guys are of a light mass, and the Freo spears are medium. But these guys also have guerrilla deployment, so you have to kind of take that into account. And, of course, the all-important thing is that these guys are available turn 1. Freo spears, you have to wait 60 turns to get them. So these guys are good. They're more defensive in your medium spears, so in early game, I'd recommend having a couple of these on the flanks to ward off cavalry, while your medium spearmen make up your main line alongside your champions. And I think they'll do really well on the flanks, and they have a better bonus versus cavalry, so they'll just do a little bit better on the flanks. That's really the place that you use them. Turn 90, you get these Arevaci armored Skitarii if you replace your early game Skitarii, and they're just insanely good. These guys are so great. They have the stats of Getic Noble Spearmen, like the early game variant. However, these guys have 225 men. They're just so good. I tested them off camera, and they beat Roman Scipii Praetorians. Those are the Praetorians from the high period of the Republic, before the Marian reforms. Which isn't saying that this unit is absurdly good in late game or anything. But if it can beat any type of Praetorian, that means that they're just really, really solid. And with 23 weapon damage and 26 charge bonus, this is such a solid unit to come from your second population class. The only weakness I can think here is that this unit only has 25 armor, which is kind of weak for late game, but at 225 men, they have to have some weakness, or else this unit would be completely overpowered. But just amongst spear units that factions recruit going like with the reforms, this is by far one of the strongest, if not the strongest in the game. I think only Eastern factions have something comparable to this. Just insanely solid. Use these guys alongside your swords as a main line going into late battles. This Skitarii will be cheaper, so if you don't have the money to afford your reformed heavy swords, load up on Skitarii. They won't let you down. This is just such a solid late game unit. Now your Noble Spearmen, we already covered them with your General, just incredibly solid. You can recruit them early on in your campaign. So I feel like early on, once you get those like level 3, level 4 settlement buildings up, you'll start getting some of these guys out of your first population. But going off into late game, I feel like the Skitarii are just better. You know, they have more charge bonus. Sure, they're not as defensively capable, but they also have 75 more men. You know, I just think that this is a more solid unit, and you can save your first population class. So I would just go for Skitarii. They're just cost-effective, just such a great unit. And as I said, I don't think these Vasky Shock Spears can be recruitable outside of your general unit. Now moving on to your missile infantry, you have a couple okay options. Like this Arevaci ambusher is shit, just statistically bad. You know, 85 range and 21 missile damage is okay, but they only have 1 armor, and they don't have good melee stats. You know? Melee attack of 9 is okay, but 6 melee defense is bad. But you know what? 24 weapon damage is actually pretty good. Pretty surprising, I have to say. And 60 charge is meh. But the thing about these guys is that they are insanely cheap. The thing is that if you're going for like a sleeper build of an Arevaci army, just trying to go as cheap as possible, you know, getting militia spears, a couple of medium spears, maybe a couple of these guys to skirmish. Like, you're just trying to make a cheeky, cheap army. Bring these guys, because they are cost-effective for the price. They're insanely cheap on the campaign map, guys. Like, 50 or less to maintain. So because of that, you can honestly definitely bring these guys in large numbers. And they could do some damage, you know? To get them on a flank charge, we could do some damage. And, you know, having 6 ammunition isn't bad. The missile damage and range is okay. For a unit of his caliber, it's pretty solid. For a unit of his cost, it's really solid. That's the thing, like, this is not a good unit, but because it's so cheap, it's good for the cost. Now, your Arevaci Nido Skirmisher, this unit, it's a lot more competent at skirmishing itself. You know, 95 range and 22 missile damage is elite. Then when it comes to actual combat ability, it's just okay. The problem with this unit is that it still maintains the 1 armor of the Ambusher, but to be fair, it is going to be more resilient in melee combat a lot, because 12 melee defense is a big difference than the 6 of the Ambusher. a little bit less combat effective, a little bit less aggressive, you know, less weapon damage, less melee attack. I mean, honestly, neither of these are going to be amazing in melee. It's more like you can get a surprising amount of damage against a decent unit with these guys, but they won't really kill a ton. But, you know, either one is okay, but not amazing by any means. Like, these guys are both okay options. They can be surprisingly cost-effective, but not elite. Not elite in the slightest. Your Arevaci slingers, they're good. For a good slinger. 11 missile damage, 190 range. Those are solid stats, but they do shoot kind of slow. You know, 5 shots per minute means that it takes 4 minutes to get all their ammo off, and that's if they're shooting continuously. You feel like they have a clean shot, which is a little bit rare for slingers. They're not very combat effective, you know. Your skirmishers, your javelin hurling skirmishers will do a lot better in melee than these guys. They're purely to shoot. They're going to be good at shooting. They do have a base morale of 27, which is a little bit lower than the Celtic variant, but still okay, still serviceable. It's just a decent slinger. Not an amazing slinger like the Balearic, but just decent. Your Arevaci medium skirmishers, these guys are kind of a hybrid melee skirmish unit. You know, for skirmishers, because they do shoot javelins, although 85 range and 19 missile damage is pathetic. It's lower than all of your other skirmishers, which are actually cheap. Where these guys are good, though, is that they have 13 melee attack and 28 weapon damage, giving them the same weapon damage as your Arevaci champions. Every time that these guys hit, they hit with the power of a noble sword, which is incredible. Like, they're not going to be as combat effective, obviously. They have lower melee defense and 20 armor, which is honestly not that far off from your Arevaci champion. And these guys have like a really strong 45 base morale, and 4 movement speed means that these guys will travel. This is honestly a really slept on unit. Like, it will enhance the overall melee effectiveness of your army so much, making these guys an expensive option, but truly a great skirmish option. And I believe that these guys come from your second population class too, so they're ultimately just really, really, really useful. Really, 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 really useful. Totally a slept-on unit, very effective. Bring him. 150 men. This unit, they'll skirmish a little bit, but they'll go into combat and just become one of the boys, one of your elite melee fighters, akin to your, you know, your nobles, your armored Skitarii, your heavy swords. They're just insanely good. Now for cavalry, you have some good cavalry options, but in general, your cavalry is a little bit hard to use because each unit is a little bit weird in its own way. This Lancer cavalry, it's weird because they have 90 men, have a light mass, but only 6 speed. These guys are weirdly slow, but then their combat stats are great. 10 melee attack and 13 melee defense is great for a Lancer. 50 charge is solid. 27 weapon damage is solid. Like, this unit's combat effective and overall cost effective, but with only 39 morale and 18 armor and 6 speed, if these guys get caught by like a better unit, you know, say a nice medium cavalry or a nice noble cavalry, they will get cut to shreds. So if you throw these guys in, be careful. Give them spear support. You know, you have no issue providing spear support as the Arevaci, but this unit does require some skill to handle because they can rout quite easily. Your Arevaci heavy cavalry, this is purely a melee cavalry. You know, it has only 40 charge, which is pretty bad. But 13 melee attack and 14 melee defense, as well as a really solid 32 weapon damage, makes these guys super combat effective against enemy cavalry. These guys are versatile. They'll go in, they'll beat the enemy cavalry, unless it's like a Parthian cataphract or a Seleucid cataphract, you know, something truly elite. And then afterwards, they'll be the sole hammer and anvil presence on the battlefield, making this 40 charge bonus not really that important. You know, if they're the only ones charging the rear, you're going to win the battle. So overall, this is just a solid melee cavalry unit, but you have to understand how to use melee cavalry unit, you know? They're a little bit nuanced. You don't just charge the rear of the enemy. You have to be kind of considerate, you know, target the enemy cavalry, counter them, and then use these guys as effectively as possible. But they're good. They're good. They're just a little bit rare to find. Missile cavalry. You do have 2 options. Your first is just your basic missile cavalry unit. I mean, these guys do offer you superior skirmishing stats with 90 range and 22 missile damage, but this unit is just extremely risky. You get them turn 1, but just very, very risky because of her armor. 4 armor is just really, really bad. Really, really bad. Unforgivably bad. These guys will die en masse, especially against Iberian factions who tend to bring these slingers and tend to bring a lot of javelin throwers too. Because I don't feel like these guys do very well. Just at 4 armor, too much of a limitation for me to risk, even if we're kind of cheap. Now your Arevaci light cavalry, you do unlock them pretty quickly. Just your tier 2 infantry barrack will give you these guys. So you do basically inevitably get them turn 6. And these guys are solid. 13 armor still makes these guys very risky, but they're still superior skirmishers and have their 8 speed. But now they have good melee stats with 13, 10, and 32 weapon damage. I mean, this is just insane. That 32 weapon damage in particular. And 40 charge bonus is still good for a unit that is basically a skirmish cavalry, right? This is the hybrid. So this is actually a solid hybrid skirmish melee cavalry. Very, very good at handling enemy skirmishers, just wiping out archers and stuff. They can go for a rear charge. They can counter enemy cavalry. If the enemy cavalry can chase you, they'll throw off your javelins, and then you can actually go in and finish them off pretty easily with this unit. So just overall, this is a great light unit to bring. Of course, you have to be careful about them getting charged and countered by enemy cavalry, so you have to micro them pretty well. But this is just a really good skirmish cavalry. If you like them, bring them. And that's when it comes to the Arevaci. Like, overall, some good melee infantry at the top, a shock option, a scare option. Some utility here at the low end, both in terms of price here and in terms of skirmish capacity here. Amazing spears, is really exceptional between your medium spear in early game, your armored Scutari in late game, and your noble spear. Some great general units that'll actually go really well with that general buff that you get across the board. Some interesting missiles with solid low tier skirmish, a good slinger, and a really good late game peltist. And for cavalry, you have some solid options, a diverse array of options. Shock cavalry here at the low end, melee cavalry here at the high end, and great skirmishers. Overall, great roster. I'm going to honestly rate it really good, and I thought they were way worse than the Lusitani. But this roster has a lot more grit, a lot more stability than the Lusitani. And far more options. A little bit higher skill to use, I would say, but overall, I'd give these guys a good 6.8 out of 10. Pretty good for a barbarian faction. Obviously this unit's a little bit limited in that it doesn't have any amazing units you can spam. The cavalry is just okay. Decent but not exceptional. And for swords can be beat quite readily. But with the guerrilla deployment and the roster that they have, this is just an above average faction in terms of killing power for sure. 5's average, 6.8 makes these guys pretty good. A pretty dang solid faction. Albeit definitely not the best in the game, but just solid and powerful. When it comes to how difficult this campaign is, it's not too hard. None of the Iberian faction campaigns are super hard. The Gallic campaigns are much harder than the Iberians, particularly because you can abuse the guerrilla deploy mechanic quite a bit against the AI. But despite that, the Iberian factions just overall have way more solid rosters. None of the Iberian factions are lacking in anything. They all have some good skirmishers, some good swordsmen, some good spearmen, some good cavalry. Literally, they all have balanced roster as well. The Gallic factions are super unbalanced. A lot of them are just specialists in one thing and mediocre at all others. Also, because of that diplomatic buff that you have, starting out in the middle of Iberia is not really that scary. And because of that, they are harder than their competitors, the Lusitani, but they're still not very hard. I would say in terms of difficulty, this is like a 3.5 out of 10. Still very beginner friendly, still very cool. And if you like spearmen, try these guys out. That's really the unique play factor here, to have just elite melee spears being the bedrock of your army. No other army in this game does this, other than I guess the Eastern factions kind of do that. But for Eastern factions, obviously the cavalry is the main star of the show and the skirmishers. When it comes to the Arevaci, it's actually your spears. So because of that, I would say this is like a 5 out of 10. If you love spears, play them. If you don't, pretty unremarkable campaign, I guess, unless you've just seen something here that you really like. The shock spears do look really cool, I can tell you. So if you want to look at them all day, it's also another reason, but a good 5 out of 10. You really have to like the roster. You have to kind of consider this a bit of a unique challenge to take the Arevaci on, but if you do that, it'll definitely be worth your time. But that's all I have to say when it comes to the Arevaci. And thanks for watching the video. If you like this guide, please like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.